Hey everyone, in this video I'll be going over how I made this balustrade coffee table. So the first thing I did was to find some scrap 2x6s, then I traced the overlap of each and cut out some squares. I ended up with 8 of these, which will go on the top and the bottom of each of these legs. These legs are from Carolina Leg Company. They're great quality and they're ready to go out of the box. So I attached the squares with both glue and screws, which will hold it securely in place. It is important to make sure that the top and the bottom square are aligned with each other, which is why I use the speed square. So here's a quick look at all 4 legs once they're finished and the legs are now ready to go. So the table apron is made from 2x4s. This is the yellow pine board that I had actually milled prior to make to a 2x4 with sharp edges. After the apron is cut to length, I went ahead and put pocket holes on each end. And if you check the description, you can actually find lengths and dimensions of each board that was cut. So if you'd like to build this table for yourself, you can definitely check out the description and find all the dimensions of everything I used. After everything on the bottom apron was cross-cut to length, I attached the pieces together using glue and pocket holes. If you have a square, be sure to check that each side is actually square and lined up, otherwise your table could be slightly thrown off and not match up on each side. After I had the bottom frame assembled, I ripped a couple 1x12s in half to make up the slats for the bottom shelf. You could also use 1x6s or basically whatever width board you want. I just already had these on hand, so that's what I used. After these boards were ripped, I then cross-cut them to the length of the width of the bottom apron. So here are the boards I just cut that make up the bottom shelf for this table. I didn't actually measure the spacing out, I just tried to space them equally. Then I secured each slat to the bottom apron using way too many brad nails. See, I told you it was way too many brad nails. Anyway, with the bottom complete, it was time to make the top apron for this table. I went ahead and set all the legs out on the bottom of the table. Then I used this scrap cutoff to equally measure the distance to the outside from each leg. This way, all the legs would be equally spaced on the bottom. Next, I measured the distance between each leg, and I cut an upper apron the length of that measurement. Then I ripped each piece of the apron in half, mainly because I couldn't find enough scrap material to make 4 pieces of the apron. So I ripped the 2 pieces in half, which gave me 4 pieces for the apron. Similarly to the bottom apron, I attached these to the legs using pocket holes. I wanted the top part of the apron to be hidden under the tabletop a little, so I used this scrap 3/4 inch appearance board to recess the pieces of the apron. Once I had the long pieces of the aprons attached, I set everything up and attached the side pieces of the apron into the frame. I used clamps to temporarily hold everything in place. Then after the screws from the pocket holes were put in, I took the clamps off. So with the main frame assembled, I flipped the table over, allowing me to put the bottom on. Once again, I used the scrap cutoff piece from earlier to center everything and line everything up with equal spacing on the outsides. The frame was then clamped to the bottom, and I attached the frame to the actual slat and the leg using screws. To give the table a better stance, I took an extra piece of the slat cut off from earlier and made some feet for the bottom of the table. These feet were then attached to the bottom using glue and, again, way too many brad nails. Which makes me wonder, is there actually a thing as too many brad nails? If you know the answer, please leave a comment, because I could definitely brush up on my brad nail etiquette. So with the bottom attached to the frame, it was time to sand out any rough edges. I left most of the rough surfaces to help give the table some character. I just took off the sharp edges and the outer edges of the table. And with the bottom finished, it was time to make the top. Normally when I make the top of a table, I try to make every board the same exact size, but for this one I just used a bunch of random boards that I already had. So each board was planed down to the same thickness, and here's a rough look at the boards that I actually used for the top. So each board making up the top was cross-cut to approximately the same length, and then each board was ripped to trim just a little bit off to help glue the boards together a little bit nicer. After the rough sides were trimmed off, I laid everything out to prepare for the glue up. I then assembled all the tabletop pieces together using just glue. In the past, I would normally use dowels to help align the tabletop pieces together, but more recently I found that that just isn't necessary, and I've had pretty good results using just glue alone. That said, it does help substantially if you're able to clamp each edge of the boards flush. That's what I'm doing here with these smaller clamps. In addition to that, I clamp a couple pieces of scrap across the top, which will serve as a straight edge to help keep the tabletop flat as it dries. I left the clamps on for about 6 hours, and then I took everything off. Next, I flush cut both edges of the tabletop so that the breadboards would have a nice straight edge to line up across. If you use this method, just remember to leave your top boards a little bit longer than you actually want, as you're taking some of the length off with these cuts. After the sides were trimmed, I cut the breadboards to length using my miter saw. So to allow for wood movement with the breadboards, I decided to use a non-conventional mortise and tenon type method. I'm using a piece of poplar 1/2 inch thick board, which will serve as a tenon within the breadboard and the table. Next, I trace these lines onto the edge of the table, and then I used my plunge router with 2 edge guides to cut mortises out where each of the lines were. This isn't the easiest technique, but it does work really well for cutting mortises out as long as you go slowly. So I'm using a 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit, which is the same thickness as the poplar tenon board that I'll be using. So I repeated the exact same process on the breadboard, and as long as you have the surface of the breadboard and the tabletop facing the same direction, it doesn't actually matter if your router is exactly centered because the offset will be in the same direction. So after the mortises were cut, I cut some tenons from the poplar board. The mortises were about 2 1/8 inches deep, so I cut the tenons 4 1/8 inches deep so that there would be just a little bit of room for movement one way or the other. Speaking of movement, you can notice here that the mortises are actually oversized, which is what allows the breadboard to move freely without stressing the wood. So I temporarily clamped the breadboards into place, then I found the center of each board of the main tabletop and marked about 1 inch or 1.25 inches off of the joint. Once I had this spot marked, I drilled down through the top and the tenons using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit. Then I glued in some poplar dowels. The dowel goes through the tabletop as well as the poplar tenon inside the mortise, which is what locks everything into place. Since the mortise is oversized, there's no need to elongate the hole within the tenon, and the dowels can be glued all the way in rather than just on the top. Next, I cut all the excess dowels off with a pole saw. The breadboards were then flush cut using my track saw. And then the rough edges were sanded out using 80 grit sandpaper. In order to give the top a little bit more detail, I routed the outside edge with a chamfer bit. And then I sanded the top down to 220. Since sanding is terrible, I'll spare you from having to watch any more sanding than you already have to do. I wanted to attach the top using Z-clips, so I used the slot cutter on my router to cut small slots for the Z-clips to go inside. Here's an up-close view to show a little bit more of what the slot cutter actually does. Next, it was time to stain the table. For the first coat, I used Minwax Classic Gray Stain. I would strongly recommend wearing a white t-shirt. That way you can definitely see the stain when you get it all over your clothes. But for real, wear gloves if you have them. Stain takes forever to get off of your hands. After the table was stained with the gray, I used Minwax Natural Stain to go over top of the gray. Rather than the stains actually mixing together, the natural stain kind of pulls some of the gray back out of the table. It's kind of strange how it works, but it gives the wood a really cool weathered finish or appearance. While the natural stain was doing its magic, I took a paintbrush and got some of the harder to reach spots and cracks with the gray stain. And then I wiped everything off with a rag. I repeated the entire process on the tabletop, and you want to put the natural stain on almost immediately after the gray stain in order to get this effect. So these are the Z-clips I mentioned earlier, and this will allow the top to expand and contract without stressing the wood and causing cracks. The Z-clips fit in the slot that I cut earlier with the router, and these clips can move freely within the slot as the wood expands and contracts. I put clamps on the top after the top was on to hold the top flat, and then I used screws to attach the top to the Z-clips. I wanted more of a flat finish on this, so I used Minwax satin polyurethane as the clear coat. About halfway through, I ran out of polyurethane, of course, so I switched over to wipe-on polyurethane. This actually worked really well, and I think it looked even better than the brush-on polyurethane. So here are some final shots of what the table looks like, and if you followed along, hopefully your table looks something like this as well. So thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Let me know what you think of the table in the comments, and stay tuned for more upcoming videos.